Alright, hello everybody, this is AW. It's kind of impromptu. Well, it is impromptu. I was listening to a video at work, and it sparked the itch to critique something. So this is a video by, I don't know the guy's name, but his channel is The Majesty of Reason, and God, what a... You can't choose a more sued name for a channel. But anyways, that's neither here nor there. It's a bunch of critiques of a bunch of ontological arguments. Like the main one I actually care about is just the Anselm one, but we may listen through to a few of them and kind of point out issues of our own. And the reason I wanted to make it is because I find so many things wrong with this person's interpretation, which, you know, like their critique is... If you interpret things wrong, the critique is even worse. But, Habayap is here with me. We might get a couple of others to chime in, but we'll see if they get in here. Anyways, let's just get going with this. And, yeah.
Aristotle's ontological argument, look at Descartes' ontological argument, and so on. So definitely check out my ontological arguments playlist.
And in fact, rather than go through the sort of more faithful to the text version of Anselm's argument, and this is the classic ontological argument from Anselm in Proslogion 2, let's just skip that one and go through the sort of...
So, I'm not going to skip it. I think premise 1 is false because God doesn't exist in my understanding. No, the idea of God exists in my...
So, let's look at the original argument. Because that is not... What he has there is not the original argument. So, Proslogion 2, actually, chapter 2 is right here. It's actually not very long. It goes, "And so, Lord, do thou, who dost give understanding to faith, give me, so far as thou knowest it to be profitable, to understand that thou art as we believe, and that thou art that which we believe. And indeed we believe that thou art a being, than which nothing greater can be conceived. Or is there no such nature, since the fool has said in his heart, there is no God? But at any rate, this very fool, when he hears of this being of which I speak, a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, understands what he hears, and what he understands is in his understanding, although he does not understand it to exist." So, here he has that the first premise is, suppose God exists in the understanding, but not in reality. That's not the first premise. The first premise is that by God we understand a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. That's the first premise. The second premise is, the fool, when he hears of this being which I speak, a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, understands what he hears. And what he understands is exists or is in his understanding, although he does not understand it to exist. For it is one thing for an object to be in the understanding, and another to understand that the object exists. When a painter first conceives of what he will afterwards perform, he has it in his understanding, but he does not yet understand it to be, because he has not yet performed it. But after he has made the painting, he both has it in his understanding, and he understands that it exists because he has made it. Hence, even the fool is convinced that something exists in the understanding, at least, than which nothing greater can be conceived. For when he hears of this, he understands it. And whatever is understood exists in the understanding. And assuredly, that than which nothing greater can be conceived cannot exist in the understanding alone. For suppose it exists in the understanding alone, then it can be conceived to exist in reality, which is greater. Therefore, if that than which nothing greater can be conceived exists in the understanding alone, the very being than which nothing greater can be conceived is one than which a greater being can be conceived. But obviously this is impossible. Hence, there is no doubt that there exists a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, and it exists both in the understanding and in reality. And here is his formulation. 1. Suppose God exists in understanding but not in reality. 2. Existence in reality is greater than existence in the understanding alone. 3, a being having all of God's properties plus existence in reality can be conceived. 4, a being having all of God's properties plus existence in reality is greater than God. That's 1 and 2. 5, a being greater than God can be conceived. 6, it is false that a being greater than God can be conceived. Definition of God. 7, so it is false that God exists in understanding but not in reality. 8, so God exists in reality. So it's not the original argument. It's clearly different. But the framing is everything. So this skips the fact that the beginning has to be, the definition of God is that than which nothing greater than can be conceived, or nothing greater can be conceived. That sets the whole thing. It's not a supposition. It's not a hypothetical that maybe God is this way. No, like that's what we mean when we say God. That's what is meant. The second thing is the fool can understand this, which is, well, can you understand the operation of greatness, and that if something is greatest, and by definition the greatest that can be conceived, can you understand that if there would be something more in some kind of ontological sense, it would be greater? And here, like, greatness here is a term that we long ago stopped using in this fashion. But it's basically an accumulation of reality. It comes down from well, it's not actually, it comes down from Platonic tradition. It is a very normal, everyday conception. You know, things are more or less real. Like, it's only when you get into, like, people who suddenly get very technical and start talking about univocity of being that all of a sudden people forget that the layers of reality make sense. You know, if you look at the Platonic examples, say, there we go. Let me. Sorry, just looking at something. I'll see if Avalonia wants to come up. What was I saying? Yeah, the concept of greatness. So if you look at, say, Plato's divided line, Plato has, like, the examples of, you know, what has more or less reality. Take an example of, say, an object like an apple. Which is more real as an apple? Well, the most real as an apple would be the actual, you know, fruit. The next, like, less real thing is perhaps, say, a sculpture of an apple that, you know, even if it was a very fine sculpture that sculpted, like, the flesh, the seeds, and all those things in between, but none of those would be, like, the real apple. You know, it follows along a lot of the logic of the apple, but not entirely. And then you, say, have a painting and then a shadow or whatever. You kind of get less and less. They're apples. You know, the shadow is the shadow of an apple. The sculpture is a sculpture of an apple. And to an extent, they share in the form of the apple. But, you know, the shadow is far less of an apple than the actual fruit. And far less of an apple than even, say, the painting, because the painting has more details that accrue to the being. So that's the measure of greatness that's being talked about in the ontological argument. Existence is an ambivalent term for us. I don't actually, I mean, the original arguments are in Latin. I can't pull up the Latin right now. Well, I could, but wouldn't be very helpful. So I don't know Latin, and I'm not about to try to go look through a dictionary just to figure it out. But at least in English, existence is an ambivalent term. We have two senses. One of them is just a sheer standing out, where something is distinct from some indeterminate background and from other beings, whatever they may be, so that imaginations in your mind exist equally as much as, say, things outside your mind. Imagination itself exists against, say, the external world. But then there's also the second sense of existence, which is a standing out of a being in the world out there, let's say. Anselm is clearly not talking about the first sense of existence of just a standing out from an indeterminate background. He's talking about an existence as something being out there. So when you understand that in existence... Yeah, go ahead.
Can I? So this supposed critique is of his is trying to draw a distinction between the greatness of a being in the mind versus in actuality or reality. But the argument acknowledges and confronts this distinction. It's in the very nature of a being greater than nothing which can be conceived to exist, to actually exist. And an example of this is think of someone who says they're they're very smart, but they don't really have anything to show for it. They don't have any works, they don't have good grades, they don't really create anything, but they claim they're actually really smart. You wouldn't really say this person is smart, and you could say they have the potential to be smart, sure, but in the same way that you can't say this smartness has actuality. A God that only exists in the mind is not the greatest being that can be conceived, because it's in a being that, the greatest being that can be conceived to exist, to have actuality.
Yeah. Just because it's to expand on with the way greatness is working, it's not just any accruing of qualities, because then you could say, well, just because something has, say, more colors, it is greater, and say, but the more colors we're talking about, it's just shades of red or something, right? It's got a million or trillion shades of red, and therefore it's greater than something that's just one single shade of red. In a way, that is true, but that's not really the relevant kind of thing. What we're talking about is more like dimensionality. So God's greatness is less about the quantity of a certain range of continuum, as much as it is about a dimensionality. What is greater, 2D or 1D? Which has more degrees of freedom? Well, 2D. What is greater, the 3D or 2D? Well, 3D. And so on and so on. What is greater? What has more degrees of activity or capacity to do anything and to be anything specific? A world that is just spatial, frozen space, no motion, or a world which includes space and time on top of those dimensions. Well, the space and time, because those accrue dimensions. You can do more, and you are more in being those. So, existence is like a dimension here, let's say. If you just take it, well, God just only exists within the mind. But then there's this dimension of existence. Let's call it, just being out there. Well, that clearly provides one more dimension than just being stuck within the imagination or, the merely subjective conception. So that's the sense of greatness that God has. And when you say the greatest conceivable being, that has the understanding that, all of these dimensions would be somehow accrued within it. Whether you do or do not cognize the consequence of what these dimensions actually are, you can understand the simple structural dynamic of the greatest conceivable being, or that than which nothing greater than can be conceived. Yeah. Anyways, we'll listen to what he says and we can respond to that.
Understanding. So that's one problem. A second problem is that in order to avoid
Ontological argument from Anselm in Proslogion 2. Let's just skip that one and go to the sort of...
So, I'm not going to skip it. I think premise 1 is false because God doesn't exist in my understanding. No, the idea of God exists in my understanding. So that's one problem. A second problem...
Yeah, that's irrelevant to the argument. If God is that, then, that, God, he phrases it so weird, that than which nothing greater than can be conceived. Or not, that than which nothing greater can be conceived. That's God. That's it. That's the concept. Him making the difference, God doesn't exist in my mind. The definition, this is one thing that people don't understand. In the argument, God is literally that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Period. If you understand that simple structure, you have the understanding of what God is. whether you can actually play that out in full detail is kind of irrelevant. So let's look at what he exactly says. Thou art a being than which nothing greater than can be conceived. And in a way, can we conceive God? Even in just like a pretentious way? In a way, yeah. I mean, actually, in our imaginations, we are, playing God, right? We can conjure things in our imaginations willy-nilly. The only thing that we can't do is like conceive. Well, obviously, we aren't capable of conceiving because we're natural beings. But we understand the concept.
Is that in order to avoid equivocation in this argument, the sense of God used throughout the argument needs to be uniform, okay? So suppose it means the idea of God. Well, then the conclusion, of course, doesn't entail that God exists. It only means that the idea of God exists in reality. But now suppose that it means like God himself, that is, the being God. God himself, that omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect, creator of the universe, whatever. In that case, however, premise 1 is quite overtly question-begging. It is equivalent to saying that there exists an X such that X is God, and X is in the understanding, and X is not in reality. But of course, to say this is to simply say, in part, that God exists. You're saying there exists an X such that X is God. And so premise 1 assumes the very thing in need of demonstration. Now, of course, this is not actually fully faithful to Anselm's text. In order to get 8 validly following, you have to say God does, in fact, exist in the understanding. And then you go on to say, okay, suppose he only exists in the understanding, but not in reality. And then you go on to conclude by reductio that no, it's actually false that God exists only in the understanding, but not in reality. And since he does, in fact, exist in the understanding, he must also thereby exist in reality. So you need an additional premise here to the effect that God does, in fact, exist in the understanding. So that's really the additional premise that I was targeting when I said, firstly, that that's false, because God doesn't exist in my understanding. The idea of God exists in my understanding, so it has a false premise. But even setting that aside, we have to talk about equivocation. And in the argument, we either mean the idea of God or God himself. If we mean the idea of God, well then, that has to be consistent throughout, and in which case the conclusion doesn't actually get us God's existence. It gets us that the idea of God exists in reality. But of course, if we mean God himself, well then, the implicit zeroth premise, that God does in fact exist in the understanding, says that there exists an X such that X is God and X is in the understanding. But of course, no atheist would ever grant that there exists an X such that X is God. So they would never grant that premise.
So again, that's just a misunderstanding. The whole thing begins with God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. That's what God is. Then there is the understanding of this, that when I understand this, I understand that involves literally the operation of being able to conceive and having a maximal conception. If I understand that, then I have a minimal determinate object of, well, there could be, or there is, a maximal being here. Now, what exactly it will entail is kind of irrelevant, so long as I understand at least the broad boundaries of that generality, that than which nothing greater can be conceived. That does not involve me having, like, an actual concrete fact of, like, a being within my mind. It involves me understanding that the structure of that being involves that than which nothing greater can be conceived. That's really what the argument is moving around. Like, it's not moving around some, like, supposed being. It's not moving around a sentence spoken of a being. It's moving around the understanding of a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, which is the entire operative concept.
And Josh Rasmussen actually really nicely makes this point. So this is a review of a book. The book is A.D. Smith's Anselm's Ontological Argument. So this is Josh writing here. He says, Anselm of Canterbury thought that belief in God can be based upon reason itself. He sought to prove God's reality by reasoning about the concept of God. God, by definition, is the greatest thinkable being. No greater being is even conceivable. Now, a being is surely greater if it exists in reality than if it exists merely in one's imagination. So, the greatest thinkable being exists in reality, and therefore God exists in reality. This classical argument feels like clever trickery. Is it? Well, nearly every philosopher since Anselm has considered the argument fallacious. Strangely, however, isolating the precise place where the argument falters has proven rather tricky. Part of the difficulty is that Anselm offers more than one version of his argument, and objections to one version don't necessarily apply to all the others. But such multiplicity notwithstanding, many philosophers think that when we clearly express Anselm's argument in any of its forms using the language of contemporary logic, we find an ambiguity in the term God. Suppose the term God is understood as a name that actually picks out an existing entity. Then the argument is circular, because the first premise assumes that God exists. Alternatively, we may understand the term God as expressing the concept of God. Then the problem is that no mere concept qualifies as the greatest thinkable being, so the argument is unsound.
Does have nothing to do with the argument. That is like one of the funniest things. Like this argument makes atheists like really uncomfortable. Like because it is what was said earlier is true, that a lot of people will go like, "There's something wrong with this argument. We just don't know exactly what, despite how simple it is."
In any case, just about everyone, theist and atheist alike, agrees there is something wrong with Anselm's classic argument. So anyway, that's a simple dilemma that kind of afflicts Anselm's ontological argument, this point about equivocation. We might try to avoid that by saying that we're just using one sense of God, but that we're talking about different ways or modes of being in which one single entity can exist, right? It can exist in a conceptual way, or...
Second, okay, like what he mentioned there, like the first one is picking out an entity that already exists. No. Is it picking out the concept of God? Yes. But then they go ahead and claim, oh, well, then concepts, don't satisfy being. Yeah, that's a presupposition, which has nothing to do with the concept. Like, I mean, that itself would be a conceptually grounded distinction, and it has its problems, which are inescapable. But a concept is what gives you the notion of a being to pick out in the first place. Even if you go and just have, like, say, the concept of what is a being in the first place. Yeah, that's going to be a concept. It's not circular to obviously use the measure that you set up to measure, if the measure is actually real. And that's a whole issue that these arguments can never answer themselves. But these people, though they bring up critiques like these, they themselves don't even have the ground to make the critique. To make the distinction between concepts and reality, you have to have a valid conception of concepts. It's not gonna work out because it's all gonna break down to some kind of assumption, some brute fact, or some other relativist nonsense in which things don't ultimately mean anything. Hegel has a good basis for answering that, but we're not going to exactly go into it. I mean, all that has to be understood is, does it make sense? Can I understand, that in which nothing greater than can be conceived? Yeah. That's all that's required. And once that is the measure set, that also gives us the means to test it. How do you test it? It's like just like the argument goes. We can, if we want to go ahead and say, well, that doesn't exist. Well, does that even make sense? Like, this is kind of a rational experiment of sorts. The fool says, well, sure, I understand what that means, but that doesn't actually exist. And it says, well, if you understood what that means, then you would have to understand that it does entail existence. Now, the reason they keep saying, oh, no, it's like picking out some kind of being, you can't get being out of a concept, is because these people keep presupposing that this God term, or the term named God, has to do with their preconceptions of God. Either it's the man in the sky, or it's whatever specific God from whatever religion that they don't particularly like, and they think it's stupid. But the ontological argument doesn't really have any problems with that, because it doesn't pick out very much of anything. All that it says is that insofar as by what one means by God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, it's going to be understood that exists. Anything further is some other argument. But all this argument settles is that. It's not objectionable. There's nothing wrong with it at all. It's trivial. I mean, I would say that anyone who understands it like really should just kind of go, okay, yeah, the argument works, but so what? You know, it's just saying like being is. It doesn't say much of anything.
Or it can exist in a real way. So it.
Are we gonna say something?
I was gonna say, I suspect, like all atheists, of being nominalists, because the key question here is whether existence is inherent in the definition of the greatest conceivable being, and it is. And once this concept is established, then it necessarily follows that such a being must necessarily exist. And just saying that it's a concept in my mind doesn't really explain away the problem, because concepts actualize themselves in certain ways, and this might be overstepping, but it reminds me of the essence energies distinction, or the noumenal phenomenal distinction. God's essence shows itself in their energies, or the noumena shows itself through the phenomena. Concepts actualize themselves. So if you understand what the concept is, then the Anselm's ontological argument, it's basically a truism.
Yeah. Like, that's what I say. It's like, it's trivial, like how true it is. It works, but you could almost say it's almost analytic. It doesn't really say much of anything. It's like, well, yeah, that which is the greatest conceivable in its own conception has to exist. But that doesn't tell you, is this the universe? Is this a person? It just says nothing about that. So, I mean, like, an atheist could make this argument. All they would just have to do is swap the word God for the universe. And if by universe, what you mean is the greatest conceivable being, sure. It works. That doesn't matter what you call it.
It's one and the same entity, and it simply enjoys different modes or ways of being. Now, firstly, this is facially implausible. That just seems deeply implausible, at least by my lights. And it's actually borderline unintelligible, this talk about modes and ways of being. But second...
One, it's not implausible. That word, plausibility, we were talking about this earlier, is one of the slimiest words in the modern lexicon of analytic people. No longer do you have to explain like some conceptual problem or show some actual like problem. All you have to say, well, that doesn't seem plausible. What does plausibility got to do with anything? Plausible, like in the way people normally use it, is like, well, given my like knowledge or beliefs about the world, if those are to remain consistent, this thing that you're telling me, it doesn't work with my belief system. Yeah, you're wrong. So what? Like, who cares about plausibility to you, or even plausibility to a group of people, like society writ large? It doesn't matter. Like, people have wrong assumptions, people have wrong beliefs. Plausibility has no weight whatsoever in philosophical discourse.
It assumes ontological pluralism, and yet we should reject ontological pluralism. Ontological pluralism is the thesis that there's more than one way of being or mode of existence. There are different kinds of existence. Some things really exist, but other things don't really exist, but only like conceptually exist. I don't know. It's really hard to make sense of, and
it's not hard to make sense of. I mean, like, the average person makes sense of it. It's just like the degrees of being thing, concerning greatness. This is a very common notion. The average person perfectly understands it. It's only these like nitwit midwits with PhDs that somehow can't make sense of everyday terms and the ways in which people think about them. Yeah, there are different ways of being. A static being and a dynamic being are clearly not existing in the same way. Presences and absences are clearly not the same modes of existence, and all that other things. 2D is not 3D, space is not time, light is not color, vision is not sound. All these things are given everybody, like if you're a human being or even just a fucking animal, we experience the distinctions immediately. This whole thing, like, oh, well, it doesn't make sense that there are different modes of being. Like, the univocity of being people they're the ones who make no sense, because then you have to abuse language so much to like redefine things in like odd ways just so that you can say this and pretend that you're actually saying something reasonable.
Plausible, and I had Trent Merrick's on my channel again to talk about why we should reject that view. And thirdly, as a third response to this, I'm going to say, if it's one and the same being in each case, well then God himself, albeit God himself existing in a conceptual mode of being, depends upon my mind. But then a mode of being of God is dependent, right? And yet God is identical to whatever God has, per divine simplicity. And Anselm, of course, accepted divine simplicity. And so God is identical to any mode of being that he has. And so God is identical to this conceptual mode of being, assuming again that the argument is talking about one and the same being just existing in different ways, which it has to if it's to avoid equivocation. But in that case, God is dependent because that conceptual mode of being depends on my mind, and moreover, God is identical to this conceptual mode of being because he's identical to everything that he has. But of course, that's incompatible with traditional theism. God is not a dependent being. And moreover, God would then be something intrinsic to but distinct from me, and so God would be a part of me, and yet that's incompatible with classical theism. God isn't a part of anything in creation. Lots of apophaticists might even reject this number 3.
I don't even know what the fuck he was referring to there. Like, what did that have to do with anything? Like, just saying, well, if it's referring to the concept in my mind, it will, at least the concept in my mind is dependent on me. What the fuck does that have to do with anything? Like, the concept is that within which nothing greater than can be conceived.
Well, it's a presupposition that concepts come from observation or are subjective, subject-centered things.
No, like that argument doesn't have anything to do with it. It's like, okay, God is that thing which nothing greater can be conceived, and like, oh, but I conceive that God is just merely a concept, and since I'm the one conceiving that concept. Somehow that concept is subservient to me. So, okay, then are you God? Well, I as a thinker can conceive something greater than me as a thinker, and therefore I clearly am not that in which nothing greater than can be conceived. And so God is reestablishing the whole following through of the thought anyways. Like, what does, like, me being the active thinker, like, of the subjective concept have anything to do with it? Nothing.
They might say, no, God is so transcendent that we can't even conceive of him. So that's another mode of criticism. Here's a still further mode of criticism.
Apophaticism has no problem with this. Apophaticism is just like, God transcends all finite limitations. Yeah. They would not deny that God has all positive properties. They would just deny that any list of properties that we could ever conceive could possibly exhaust the nature of God, because any property would be a finite thing, but God is infinite. And only in conceiving the infinite as, that which is beyond limitation, beyond finitude, do we get the proper conception of God. And even that's only a negative conception, because they won't admit that that is a positive conception. They'll say, well, that's just us holding back from putting any limit upon God, but you're still doing it.
Premise 2 here is false. Existence in reality is greater than existence in the understanding alone. I think that is straightforwardly false. And let's look at Alexander Proust, explain why. So Alexander Proust, he says, it makes no sense to talk of the greatness of a non-existent being except hypothetically, as the greatness it would have if it existed. When we compare the greatness of things, we compare what the things would be like if they existed. Thus, when we say that Thor is greater than Hermes, we mean something like this. If Thor existed, he would be greater than Hermes would be if Hermes existed. And to exist is to exist in reality. But now take the crucial claim in Anselm's argument that it is greater for X. But now take the crucial claim in Anselm's argument that it is greater for X to exist in mind and in reality. But now take the crucial claim in Anselm's argument that it is greater for X to exist in mind and in reality than just in mind. This claim is simply false when we understand it in the hypothetical way. For we need to compare the greatness of the X that exists in mind and reality to the greatness that the X that exists only in mind would have if it existed in reality. but that's the same greatness. So Anselm's original ontological argument has just a clearly false premise 2.
Yeah, no, this guy has no idea what that means.
This has to be a willful misunderstanding at this point.
No, yeah, because they're like, oh, but it's actually hypothetical. No, there's nothing hypothetical. There's not like, well, suppose, like see here, like he injects the suppose. Suppose God exists in understanding. No. The premise, the original first premise is God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. That's not a hypothetical. It's not a maybe. It's not a suppose God is this. God is this. This is what we mean. This is what is meant. Once that is set, it is said that the atheist says, suppose that I understand what that means, but I understand that this only really exists hypothetically in my mind, or as a concept in my mind. Like, it's the hypothetical is only for the atheist. It's not for, like, the definition. The definition is not a hypothetical at all. The premise of God is not hypothetical here. God is this. This is what we mean. It's like saying, look, a triangle has 3 sides. It's not a hypothetical. We're stipulating what it is. The next question is, okay, are there triangles? Can we demonstrate that there are triangles? Does it make sense that there are triangles? Those are the things that can follow. It's not a hypothetical. Let me go slightly back. So, so it makes no sense to talk about the greatness of a non-existent being. Well, God is not non-existent. God is neither premised as being existent or non-existent. All that God is defined as is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So we're not talking about, well, if, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, then God would exist. No. It's God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Then the question is, well, does existence follow? So what's this saying? But now take the crucial claim in Anselm's argument that it is greater for X to exist in mind and in reality than just in mind. This claim is simply false when we understand it in the hypothetical way, for we need to compare the greatness of the X that exists in mind and reality to the greatness of the X exists only in mind would have if it exists in reality. But that's the same greatness. Yeah, it's irrelevant. So this is weird. They said existence is not a property. Well, no, this argument is, the objection isn't even that existence is not a property, it's just saying, oh, like the existence of the things is hypothetical is equal either way. Both of them are hypothetical. There is no actual existence, but Anselm's not talking about them. Anselm's talking about existence, actual existence out there, which is a property, even though, basic existence as just a mere standing out from a background is not, but standing out there in the natural world is. Or whatever the out there is. I mean, with God, it wouldn't even... The existence goes even beyond that.
X that exists in mind and reality to the greatness that the X that exists only in mind would have if it existed in reality. But that's the same greatness. So Anselm's original ontological argument has just a clearly false premise 2, at least by my lights. Moreover, a still further criticism of Anselm's ontological argument derives from the distinction between encoded and attributed properties. And to bring out this point, we are going to listen to what I say in my 3K AMA. So this isn't actually my 3K AMA, it's a clip from my 3K AMA, but it's actually my video 4 ontological arguments in 12 minutes. I've put it on 1.5 times speed, and this is the criticism from the distinction between encoded and attributed properties.
A third problem that I would say is one that Oppie's written on. He makes a distinction between encoded and attributed properties. He talks about this in his Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on ontological arguments. So Oppie writes, following Anselm, we might say that since you understand the expression smallest really existent Martian, there is, in your understanding, at least one smallest really existent Martian. However, in saying this, it must be understood that we are not actually predicating properties of anything. We aren't supposing that there is something which possesses the properties of being a Martian really existing and being no larger than any other Martian. In other words, we must be able to have the concept of, or entertain the idea of, a smallest really existing Martian without believing that there really are any smallest Martians. Indeed, more strongly, we must be able to entertain the concept of a smallest really existent Martian and to to recognize that the property of really existing is part of this concept, while nonetheless maintaining that there are no smallest existent Martians. It'll be useful to introduce vocabulary to mark the point which is being made here. We could, for instance, distinguish between the properties which are encoded in an idea or concept and the properties which are attributed in positive atomic beliefs which have that idea or concept as an ingredient. The idea, really existent Santa Claus, encodes the property of real existence, but it is perfectly possible to entertain this idea without attributing real existence to Santa Claus, that is, without believing that Santa Claus really exists. We can then apply this distinction to Anselm's argument. On the one hand, the idea, being than which no greater can be conceived, encodes the property of real existence. This is what the Reductio argument from Anselm establishes, if it establishes anything at all. On the other hand, it is perfectly possible to entertain the idea of a being than which no greater can be conceived, and to recognize that this idea encodes the property of real existence without attributing real existence to a being than which no greater can be conceived. That is, without believing that a being than which no greater can be conceived really exists. Okay, so those are my three main issues. I mean, there are more, but those are my three. So you can see my video, Ontological Arguments with Tyron Goldschmidt, but those are my three main issues.
The first objection was that no, God doesn't exist in your understanding. The idea of God exists in your understanding, so the implicit premise here is false. Another objection was that...
Yeah, that's wrong. Like, that distinction doesn't matter. All you need to understand is the concept, and if you understand what the concept entails, it entails what it entails.
In order to avoid equivocation, you have to precisify what you are meaning by God, and you either mean...
Yeah, well, what he means by God is the concept of that in which nothing greater than can be conceived. It's not mysterious. There is no ambivalence. It's not like it's pointing out some pre-existing object. It's not that it's pointing out some hypothetical object or pointing to a object that is merely stipulated as being a concept. The concept itself is that than in which nothing greater can be conceived.
The idea of God or God himself. In the first case, the conclusion doesn't get you God's existence, but in the second case, the argument is blatantly question-begging. So that's the second response. The third response is that it seems to rely on ontological pluralism, but we should reject ontological pluralism.
Yeah, that's retarded. Anybody who claims to not be an ontological pluralist about these things is lying to you. And I do mean that. They're lying to you. Maybe they have pretended to themselves that they believe this, but they in no way live like this, guaranteed.
A fourth criticism is someone who is inclined to apophatic theology might reject.
Apophaticism has nothing to do with this.
To premise 3, they might say that God isn't, after all, conceivable. A fifth objection is that no, premise 2 is false. That was Proust's point about hypothetical greatness, so that's a fifth response. A sixth response is this distinction between encoded and attributed properties that Oppie makes and applies to the argument. And now here's...
Yeah, that encoded attributed properties has nothing to do with it again. Like, it only if you think that this is picking out either some pre-existing object or picking out an object specified as being merely a concept, a subjective conception. He gave the example, like, what if we, conceptualize, the smallest conceivable Martian? He's like, well, the smallest conceivable Martians don't exist, but, we could conceive that there might be some smallest conceivable Martian. That analogy is completely stupid. God is not some finite thing that you can, slap things in and out. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. No further qualifications. If you understand what is entailed by that, in that understanding, it has to exist.
The seventh response. Everyone pronounces it differently, but what? Gaunilo? Gaunilo's greatest conceivable island parody. Now, I actually used to think this argument failed, but one of Graham Oppie's recent publications, published in 2017, actually seems to have convinced me that no, it doesn't actually fail.
No,
So suppose that the greatest conceivable island, which of course the fool who denies such a thing, denies the reality of such a thing, understands, of course, and of course whatever is understood exists in the understanding, so the greatest conceivable island exists in the understanding. Now suppose that the greatest conceivable island exists in the understanding but not in reality. Well, existence in reality is greater than existence in the understanding alone. And, moreover, having all the properties of this greatest conceivable island plus existence in reality can be conceived, right? I can certainly conceive of this island existing. So, a being having all of this island's properties plus existence in reality is greater than this greatest conceivable island. Because, again, we're assuming that the greatest conceivable island only exists in the understanding.
So, Anselm actually wrote a response to Gaunilo, pointing out that argument is retarded. And I mean it's retarded. It's behind the concept. It's not even catching up to the basic premises of the original argument. God is not synthetically added existence. It's not like, oh, well, the greatest conceivable island, would have all these and this, and it would exist. God's concept, what God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Inherently entailed in that is existence, as a consequence of what that means. There's nothing about an island as such, an island, just an island. This is God as such, and therefore an island as such has no entailment of whatever other synthetic things that you want to add to it. You can think like, well, the greatest island, suppose that, I don't know, like you like fat hippos, those like mudangs. Yeah, that's not what it's called. That stupid little hippo. You think that's like one of the greatest things. So the greatest possible island, needs to have a mudang or a bunch of mudangs. That's just an external positing. That's just a subjective addition. It's an external synthesis. Nothing about an island requires hippos. Nothing about an island requires that it necessarily exists. But the greatest conceivable being, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, does inherently entail and necessitate that it exists. That's the difference between God and the island, or the greatest conceivable pineapple, or any other example. Literally, this argument only works because the definition of God is not this greatest conceivable thing. It is the greatest conceivable thing, period. So, to maybe clarify that again is, there's not God, and on top of that, God has the property of being the greatest conceivable thing. No. God is the greatest conceivable being. Period. Now, maybe you don't like calling God. Maybe you want to call it the universe. Maybe you want to call it a pineapple. It doesn't fucking matter. So long as you understand that it means the greatest conceivable being, it will always be the same.
And yet we can conceive of one that exists in the understanding and in reality, and yet that would be better. So an island greater than the greatest conceivable island can be conceived. But that, of course, is absurd. Then you'd be conceiving of something greater than literally the greatest conceivable island. That's just incoherent. And so it's false that the greatest conceivable island exists only in the understanding, but not also in reality. And since it does exist in the understanding, it must also thereby exist in reality. Bada bing, bada boom, we've proved a greatest conceivable island. So here is the 2017 article from Graham Oppie that I am talking about. I believe this is published with Palgrave Macmillan. I think it's in some sort of reference book that they publish. Yeah, Macmillan Interdisciplinary Handbooks. Anyway, he contributed a chapter to one of the handbooks. Anselm's argument, we can equally construct a parody. Here's the parody that he goes through. I'm not going to go through it because I basically just gave one. Now, Graham Oppie then points out how, it just seems obvious that there's a kind of epistemic parity with a T between them. There's a kind of symmetry between them.
There
now,
isn't.
Oppie also addresses the reason that I was hesitant to think that Gaunilo's greatest conceivable island objection succeeds. So it's sometimes said that Gaunilo's objection fails because there is, and can be, no such thing as an island than which no greater island can be conceived. For example, Plantinga says, the idea of an island than which it is not possible that there be a greater is like the idea of a natural number than which it is not possible that there be a greater, or the idea of a line than which none more crooked is possible. There neither is nor could be a greatest possible number. Indeed, there isn't a greatest actual number. And the same goes for islands. No matter how great an island is, no matter how many Nubian maidens and dancing girls adorn it, there could always be greater, one with twice as many, for example. The qualities that make for greatness in islands, number of palm trees, amount and quality of coconuts, for example, have no intrinsic maximum. That is, there is no degree of productivity or number of palm trees or of dancing girls such that it is impossible that an island display more of that quality. So the idea of a greatest possible island is an inconsistent or incoherent idea. It's not possible that there is such a being. It's this response that the great-making properties of an island don't have any intrinsic maxima. But there are a number of problems with this. Here are 6.
Let me say it. Plantinga is an idiot. The fact that Plantinga is famous for one of the dumbest ontological arguments ought to say that. This response is stupid. Now, I don't care whether a formally works for this kind of moronic take in the first place. The fact is that all you have to say is like, well, the original response, which is, this class of object is not the same. The greatness that God has is not a numerical, quantitative greatness. Adding more coconuts, adding more atoms, adding more shades of red does nothing to even close the gap with God. God deals with dimensional greatness. God not only has, infinite in extent, he's not just like great in that way. God is great in that he has infinite dimensionality. And anybody who didn't understand that from the concept, I don't know what the fuck they think they're thinking. Because they're not thinking about what the concept really entails. They're not really paying attention to what greatness, the degrees of reality, which, like I said earlier, just take the Platonic divided line. It's straightforward. Which is more real? How much more dimensionality is it? You have the shadow of the apple, you have the painting of the apple, you have the photograph of the apple, you have the fully detailed inside and outer sculpture of the apple, and then you have the actual fruit. These are in degrees of greatness, degrees of dimensional reality. That's what's important. The numerical stuff doesn't matter.
Replies. So first, surely, at least for Christians, they want to say that God's being Trinitarian is one of God's great-making features. What, you think that makes God worse or doesn't even at all contribute to his value? No, that's one of the central aspects of Christianity. But then, the number of divine persons in which God exists likewise admits of no intrinsic maximum. Plantinga's response here would equally apply.
Actually, it's funny. This guy actually specializes in theology, but he doesn't know that there are plenty of people who did argue that there is a reason that it's 3 and not more or less. There's been plenty of arguments about that. Also, I've actually never heard that, the fact that, God has 3 persons, that's a great making quality. What? The qualities that are great making is not the numerical quantity of like the persons of the Godhead. The quantities that are the qualities that are great making. There's like omnipotence, omnibenevolence, omniscience, blah blah blah. The omnis.
To the greatest conceivable being, at least with respect to Christianity. Because this great-making feature of God, namely the number of divine persons, that's a quantitative feature. It's the number of divine persons. And so, just like the amount of coconuts, or the number of coconuts, as he should have said, it's not an amount. An amount is a mass noun rather than a count noun. He should have said the number of coconuts. I myself make that mistake quite often. But anyway, set that aside. The number of coconuts.
Amount is a mass noun, not a count noun. I've never heard that one.
That's a quantitative attribute. It doesn't have any intrinsic maximum. You could always, in principle, have one more coconut, let's say. You could just add 1 to the number of coconuts. Maybe it's 100,000. You could have 100,001. But of course, the exact same is true of the number of divine persons. That's a quantitative attribute. God...
Nah. No. Well, if you're watching this, you probably follow my channel, so you know where I stand with that. Hegel does have an argument for the necessity of 3 and exactly only 3 persons of the divine Trinity. It's what the structure of the concept is about. You have the universal, particular, individual. There can be no more, there can be no less.
Exists in exactly 3 persons, not 4, not 5, not 6, not 7, and so the number doesn't admit of any intrinsic maximum. Similar things can be said about the strengths of God's reasons and desires. So, God desires some things more than he desires others. For instance, he desires that at least some people be saved more than that he desires that no people be saved. He desires to bring about great goods more than he desires not to bring about great goods, and so on. If you deny this, if you say that all of God's desires are like literally infinitely intense, then you completely gut theism of its explanatory power. Then you're not going to be able to generate any predictions whatsoever, because literally anything that God could potentially desire, he desires to an unlimited degree. And so we are left completely in the dark as to what he would in fact do, because his preference structure wouldn't then generate any predictions about which among the infinitely many things that he could desire, like the infinitely many goods that could possibly obtain, We have no guidance here whatsoever. Moreover, a perfectly rational being would have a preference or desire structure which tracks objective values and the relative weights of them. So some worlds are going to be objectively more valuable than others. So some possible worlds are such that they have lots of people living very happy and flourishing lives, whereas some other worlds are going to have only a couple people living very, very mild lives. The former world is much more valuable than the latter world, and so a perfectly moral and perfectly rational being should have a preference structure or desire structure which is such that the perfect being desires the world that's better than the other world. It desires it more than the other one. It would be absurd to say that God desires these two equally. That would just be absurd. And so, God's desires and the very strength of reasons for which he...
Modalists are retarded. Just going to say it.
I agree.
I don't think I've mentioned this like too much on the channel, like, so maybe people don't know. But this whole talk about, possible worlds, possibility as such, what people generally like call modality, it's all stupid. It's all based on a complete misunderstanding about how possibilities even work in the first place. Hegel is probably just has the best clarity on this about why this stuff makes no sense. All possibility comes from actuality. If you have a possibility, it's an actual possibility. It has some degree of actuality, has some degree of reality already. There are no possibilities as such that aren't already hooked into some actuality, by which they would be a possibility in the first place. God does not consider possibilities, because for God there is no distinction between what God thinks and the existence of things. So in this case, whatever God thinks, and God thinks only, perfect things, exists. There is no this world and that world. There's only one world, the actual world, in which whatever's going on is indeed by the complete knowledge and judgment of God that in some fashion this is good. That we could or could not tell to what ultimate end any empirical set of events are for. That's just a limitation that we have. God doesn't have that. And I don't know why people have to point out this thing God would will this possible world over that possible world. We already have a real world in which people live through hell and through heaven. There are people right now living what you could easily imagine hell would be. There are people right now living in what you could easily imagine heaven would be. The people in hell are far greater than the number of people who are experiencing that heaven. But they all live in this same world. You don't have to make up these hypothetical possible worlds to understand that. And clearly there has to be some, at least in the Christian worldview, there is some divine plan, also the Muslim and the Jewish worldview. And there's some divine plan, and they have no problem with going, well, stuff is happening, we don't exactly know why, but God is in control of it all. God knows, God is guiding things. We may have some response to play, but beyond that, yeah. And just to add a little thing to the possibility thing, pure possibility is basically impossible. When you say, well, this is just purely possible, but it's not actual, what you're saying is, I'm conceiving something which is utterly disconnected from the conditions of possibility of its very being. Which means that either you're considering nonsense, or you're considering something nonsensically. So, if you consider something which has no connection to any existence whatsoever, no actuality, you're basically considering something that has no conceptual relation and intelligibility whatsoever, so it's nonsense. And if you're considering something that does actually have some kind of relation to actuality, but you're considering it away from its actual existence, and you're just projecting some kind of abstraction. You say, let's take a simple one that people always use, like Kant. We can imagine, hypothetically, the possibility that, we were all billionaires. And somehow inflation would not happen, right? All these other problems that if we actually think about the consequence just wouldn't work. And so a lot of people think that because you say things and you choose what works in abstraction and like pay no attention to the actual consequence, even in the abstraction, as to what would happen if you actually had that scenario, that just because you do that, you've made something possible. No, you're just thinking about it nonsensically. You're not thinking about nonsense. There is some intelligibility to what you're saying. There's some sense to it. But you're not fully treating that sense with, like, the consequence that is entailed in the abstraction that you set up. I don't know if that makes sense.
Checks out.
Acts, those also in some sense admit of degrees. And these are, moreover, great-making features of God. It is a great-making feature of God that he has a perfectly rational, perfectly good preference structure that accurately maps and tracks the objective values of things and how they compare with one another. And so...
No. God doesn't track shit. Again, like God has intellectual intuition. If you don't know what that is, just look it up. It basically means that for God, thinking and being are the exact same thing. As God thinks, things actually are. So God isn't like us where we have to track how things actually are. God directly thinks what things are themselves. So no, that's not a great making quality. Not in the way he says anyways.
So the exact same thing that Plantinga is pointing out here with respect to islands is also true of God. Various great-making features of God are also such that they are degreed or quantitative, and they don't admit of an intrinsic maximum. God doesn't hit that intrinsic maximum because sometimes, to be perfectly rational, you have to desire some things more than others, or the degree to which you...
God does hit the intrinsic maxims. They literally are them. It's impossible for God not to be them. And God does not relate to things in, like, their imperfect perception like we do.
The reason to do one thing is stronger than the degree to which you have reason to do another thing. So that's the first response. It's just that the exact same point that Plantinga is making with respect to islands also applies to at least the Christian God, and I've argued the theistic God more generally with respect to strengths of reasons and desires. Second, Plantinga here is seeming to suggest that the coherence of an idea requires the possibility of its referent, right? He's saying, no, there neither is nor could be a greatest possible number. And he's trying to conclude from this that, no, the idea is either inconsistent or incoherent or whatever. But if a condition on being a coherent idea is the possibility of its referent, or if the coherence of an idea requires the possibility of its referent, then the coherence of the idea of the greatest conceivable being similarly requires the possibility of a greatest conceivable being.
That argument doesn't even work. Like, the issue, like Plantinga is pointing out, is not that there is no referent greatest possible number. It's not a problem of reference. It's a problem that what it means to be a number is that there can be no greatest possible number. There is no final number. There's no final quantity. There's always one more. You can always add one more. It's not a reference problem. I don't know what the fuck this guy's thinking. Well, he's clearly not thinking about it. And so, like, the issue of the greatest conceivable being is also not a reference problem. It's a problem of, is that intelligible? Is it intelligible that there could be a greatest conceivable being that would not include existence? Well, no, that there isn't. I don't have to enumerate what the actual, like, full, like, qualities and consequences of the greatest conceivable being is. I just have to understand that at least the negative limitation implied in that concept about, something which would bound it. If I can see that there is something that binds it and that there's something that goes beyond it, I have already overleapt my finitization of that concept and proven myself wrong in understanding that concept.
But we already know by the modal ontological argument that the possibility of a greatest conceivable being implies its actuality. And so Anselm's argument, per Plantinga's reply here, would require the coherence of the idea of the greatest conceivable being, which in turn would require the possibility of such a being, which in turn, given the standard system of modal logic S5, would require its actuality. But of course, in that case, affirming the coherence of the idea is simply to beg the very question at issue. It is to simply assume the existence of the greatest conceivable being in an argument attempting to demonstrate that very thing.
Nope.
Again, like no assumption is required. If you understand that than which nothing greater than can be conceived, it is immediately entailed that that involves existence. The only reason anybody wants to say, well, you haven't proven that it exists, is because they keep thinking that this is referring to the man in the sky or some other finite representation they have about what this means and what they associate with. But literally all this means is the greatest conceivable thing obviously is going to exist. Doesn't tell you what that greatest conceivable thing is or what it like entails in its details, whether it's a person or it's just an inanimate like force, whatever. It's pretty stupid.
A third response is another reason for thinking that it's unclear how God's various great-making attributes could hit intrinsic maxima. So, for instance, the intrinsic maximum of justice and mercy, it's difficult to see how God could hit their intrinsic maxima. You would think that a maximally just judge would not be lenient in any sense. It would divvy up punishments and rewards to people exactly in proportion to their merit or what they deserve. But of course, that's precisely what mercy doesn't do. Mercy gives, in some sense, less punishment than deserved, or perhaps more reward than deserved. So, a maximally merciful judge, it would seem, would not be a maximally just judge. And so it doesn't seem to be the case that God could hit the intrinsic maxima of justice and mercy. There would seem to have to be some kind of trade-off between the two. At the very least, this is a potentially problematic aspect of Plantinga's response on behalf of Anselm's argument in response.
Actually, Hegel's a very good solution for that. The attributes are not equal. Some attributes are greater than others. And I would dare say that he would put the attribute here of mercy above justice. So that one could only be maximally just within having, some level of mercy. Obviously, the level of mercy in the Christian perspective, at least, is not exactly that you don't get any pain or any justice. It's just that the wages of sin. The wage of sin is death. For any sin, any sin whatsoever, smallest white lie to the biggest horrible crimes, sin is sin, death to all of it. God's mercy is that you ain't gonna die. Doesn't mean that you aren't gonna pay for some of that sin. I mean, that's what the whole idea of purgatory is. One may argue that maybe purgatory is not part of the Christian worldview, although, I mean, it's kind of ambiguous with the concept of hell, depending on how you interpret hell, and there are interpretations of hell, believe it or not. It's not consistent in the Bible.
To the Gaunilo parody. Anyway, that's the third point. The fourth point in response to Plantinga is that it's unclear whether admitting of higher quantities or degrees of great-making features would automatically make the island better. Perhaps there's an ideal, unique concoction of quantities and degrees of great-making features. Maybe there is actually a precise number of coconuts and a precise size of the island and so on, which is the ideal, unique concoction of quantities and degrees which render it the best possible, indeed the best conceivable island. Nothing...
This is analytic word salad. Just because you say shit doesn't make it a concept. Just saying like, oh, maybe there is this. Maybe it's just some random number. Maybe the greatest possible island involves, some kind of like green alien dudes from the 18th dimension. You're just fucking like spitballing, like throwing darts at a wall that's 100 miles away, seeing what fucking sticks. None of it sticks. Because that's not how concepts work. You don't just fucking slap whatever the shit together and go, well, maybe it's possible. It doesn't mean anything.
Well, it's not just that he doesn't understand the concept. It's that he doesn't understand the argument, because the argument isn't making some general rule that any concept can be predicated into existence. It's specifically concerned with the greatest conceivable being.
Yeah. And it's not even about like any particular list of predications. It's about just like, it's about the measure of reality. So again, like he said, like that he fundamentally disagrees. He's some kind of like dirty monist, and normally I don't do this, but you know, when somebody like says stupid shit like this, it's got to be called out. You know, dualists get like a bad rap, have gotten a bad rap for a couple hundred years, but the monists have kind of gotten away underneath, you know, because they don't come out to shit talk very much. But this is a dirty monist doing some shit talking right there. Because of that, you know, he takes being to be univocal, you know, being that there's only like one way to be, all things are in the same way. He rejects, by definition, the hierarchy of being or the degrees of being. So, you know, the everyday notion implied by like the Platonic divided line, he says doesn't make sense to him. Well, it does make sense to him. I bet he would agree that, you know, a very realistic looking donut that mimics, but is not in fact a donut. It's not actually food. It's just like very synthetic stuff that, you know, it's a very realistic sculpture, let's say, of a donut from the inside to the outside. You know, you would say, well, like from the outside, well, look, they're both donuts. But, you know, when you check the composition, all these other things, well, one of them is the actual donut and the other one is not. Well, they both are donuts to an extent. The question is, how much of a donut are they? He's one of these people who said, like, it's on or off. It's either it is completely or it's not at all. That's not how we actually deal with things. You know, we do have these variations. We do have these degrees, and it makes perfectly good sense.
Plantinga says rules this out, and yet he would need to rule it out in order for his defense of the argument to succeed. Fifth, we can just modify the island example in the following way. Instead of focusing on the greatest conceivable island, we can focus on the island that is the greatest conceivable simply with respect to its existential status. That is, the way in which it exists and whether it exists.
Yeah, again, like, word salad. Just because you fucking, like, try to phrase things in a certain way and qualify them doesn't make it work, because the original argument is not about a sentence. The original argument is about a concept, is that than which nothing greater than can be conceived. That's the operative concept. It's not some concept being qualified by many other things. It's one single concept.
This completely avoids the intrinsic maximum point, because we're not talking about the greatest conceivable island as such. We're talking about that island which is simply the greatest conceivable with respect to its existential status. And you're going to be able to conclude that the island in question exists, but you're also going to be able to prove the existence of basically anything. You could talk about that unicorn, which is the greatest conceivable simply with respect to its existential status. And so if the unicorn, which is the greatest conceivable with respect to its existential status, didn't exist, well, then we could conceive of one that is better with respect to its existential status, which is absurd. This is the greatest conceivable unicorn with respect to its existential status. And so we can prove the existence of basically anything, so it seems. That's the fifth response. The sixth response is that the example of an island is entirely tangential. We can pick out something which actually does seem to have intrinsic maxima for its great-making features. So consider a solo omniscient being. A solo omniscient being is a necessary being who, by nature, has exactly one ability: to know the truth values of propositions. Given this, the idea of the greatest conceivable solo omniscient...
This is the longest non sequitur I've ever heard.
Yeah,
For
like
someone
a lot
named
of,
Majesty of Reason, it's not very rational.
no, yeah, a lot of these just miss the point. They have nothing to do with it. What was he just saying right now? Oh yeah, I was gonna comment that it's so funny that like these people like consider knowledge merely to be propositional. Like, oh, you know, it's an omniscient being, so it knows the truth value of every proposition. Fuck, I mean, you get a Heideggerian, you're like, oh, you have an omniscient being. Oh, so this fucker knows like the entire revelation of all beings, including the revelation of being itself. I mean, fuck propositions. I mean, it's like having a direct intuition of all experiential things, inside and out. Not only would you have like a verbal answer to say, what is love, you would know love in like the direct, intuitive sense of it, being able to experience it and like having no question about what it is. Imagine that you thought like all knowledge could be consummated into like sentences about things, but not the actual apprehension or like sensation or experience of those things. What the fuck you say like, elephants, are these African animals mean to a being that does not live in space and time, doesn't see shit, doesn't experience living things out there, doesn't have imagination? That's just a bunch of words. They don't mean anything. And to say like, oh, well, an omniscient being that knows everything would just happen to know these completely meaningless sentences referring to things that are beyond its own experience. What? I don't know, it's small-minded.
Being is perfectly coherent, unlike an island which has very...
It's not perfectly coherent, by the way. Knowledge is not propositions, so like just because one says so, it doesn't make it so. Knowledge does involve intellectual intuition about pure sense, pure meanings. You may want to call it semantics, but you can directly apprehend it if you actually work things out in any thought. Like in the same way that that you can work out that if a triangle is a structure, the minimal structure of the enclosement of a 2D space, within 2D by straight lines, that this is going to have three sides, that they're going to connect at three angles, that the sum of those angles is going to be a certain amount, call it 180 degrees or whatever else you use. They can be subdivided into a right triangle no matter what, from any altitude down to the base, blah, blah, blah. All these things, the same way that you can check that, it's the same way that you can check that, being is nothing, becoming, existence. What is an essence? Is appearance essential to essence? Is essence apparent in appearance? All these are things that they're not propositional in the way that most of these people think.
Has great making capacities that admit of higher quantities in degrees. A solo omniscient being has only one great making capacity, and that capacity has an intrinsic maximum, namely omniscience, that is, knowing the truth value of every proposition. And we can then run the argument with a solo omniscient being. We can run a parity argument with a solo omniscient being. It exists in the understanding, because you understand it, and whatever is understood exists in the understanding. And moreover, it would be a better solo omniscient being if it existed in reality than if it just existed in the mind. And so if it didn't also exist in reality, we could conceive of a greater solo omniscient being.
Same problem as the island. It's not inherent to this supposed hypothetical being that it is the greatest conceivable being.
Than the greatest conceivable solo omniscient being, which of course is absurd, and hence such a thing actually exists in reality. But that, of course, that's an absurd parody, just like the greatest conceivable island parody. For starters, it implies that God isn't the only necessary omniscient being, which is incompatible with traditional theism, and moreover, we can also now prove infinitely many such beings. We can just consider a solo omniscient -1 being, which is a being just like a solo omniscient being, that is simply by nature unable to know one specific truth. This being, too, has great-making features not admitting of an intrinsic maximum. It's impossible for such a being to know that specific truth that it doesn't have, and so it's no mark against its greatness as a solo omniscient -1 being that it doesn't know it. So again, we still have absurd parodies in the neighborhood, even if we grant Plantinga's point about, okay, fine, maybe islands have great-making features which admit of greater quantity or greater degree, and that this somehow debars there from being a coherent idea of the greatest conceivable island. Even if we granted in that, which I've argued that we shouldn't, we can still run parody arguments that generate absurdities. So here's what Oppie says in response to Plantinga. Note, however, that it is supposed to be uncontroversial that the words "that than which no greater can be conceived" are understood. If we are going to enter into controversial philosophical arguments about whether words are, in some technical sense, coherent, for example, whether they refer to something that could possibly exist, then it is controversial whether the words "that than which no greater can be conceived" are understood. There are plenty of controversial philosophical arguments for the conclusion that the words "that than which no greater can be conceived" are incoherent in relevant technical senses. It is, for example, highly controversial whether the words "that than which no greater can be conceived" refer to something that could possibly exist. And I add here that no atheist would ever grant that it's even possible, given what we know from the modal ontological argument debate. It's also worth...
One, this is not the modal ontological argument, and two, it is perfectly clear what that than which nothing greater than can be conceived it means. It's very simple. It's like a math function that just iterates upon itself. You don't have to cash out exactly what the consequence is. You don't have to finish the equation. You just have to understand the operation. So long as you can go like, well, what if God is this particular finite thing? Well, can you conceive something greater? Yeah. Then God is not that. God is even greater. The argument here particularly focuses on the standpoint of what if you deny that existence is part of it? Well, obviously, it can be conceived even greater than just existing within your own conception. Therefore, whatever God is, certainly has to exist. That's it. Nothing else to be said about it. The argument concerns nothing else. If you want to consider, well, what is the fully cashed out greatest conceivable being, than which nothing greater can be conceived? That's a whole different set of arguments. And there are sets of arguments, there are the arguments for why God must be omnipotent, why God must be omniscient, why God must be omnibenevolent. I think it's the three omnis. And how those cascade out of, a being that has to be the greatest conceivable. So it's not like that there is no set of arguments for how to determine certain specific things about this. It's just that there are different arguments.
Noting that it is controversial whether considerations about an intrinsic maximum suggest that there is a more serious worry about the coherence of the words that island than which no greater can be conceived than there is about the coherence of the words that being than which no greater can be conceived. On the one hand, greatness for islands involves trading off a whole lot of considerations, including size, ecodiversity, population, and so forth. An island than which no greater can be conceived will not be too large, nor too crowded with palm trees, islands than which no greater jointly coincide. Some philosophers, in order to be able to see that there can be no such thing. Tell me, which is that we have to.
Let's skip that.
Can be conceived, exist at least in the mind. Premise 2, it is greater to exist in reality than to exist only in the mind. 3, so a being which no greater can be conceived exists not only in the mind but also in reality. And then the conclusion, so God exists.
Now, basically everything that I said with respect to the previous version applies here. You still have the point about existing in the mind versus existing in reality. So you have still the point about ontological pluralism. You have the point that no, the greatest conceivable being doesn't actually exist in my mind. The idea exists in my mind. You have the point about encoded versus attributed properties. You have the point about...
There you go, classic Anselmian ontological argument.
Yeah, this is actually the argument, the version of the ontological argument that most atheists on YouTube actually target, which is interesting. We're going to see because there's so many different versions. They kind of attack the oldest and the easiest to respond to.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Which is because you guys are including this in a list of 150.
True. This is indeed the oldest ontological argument. But I find that it is, in fact, not the easiest for them to respond. It is the one that they just can't fucking refute. So they go for these other reframings of quote-unquote more modern arguments, which have, because of the way that they're framed, and they're framed, say, in the post-Enlightenment turn, which becomes more analytically minded, because they fall into this qualification propositional form. They're not as good as the original, which just rests upon a simple concept.
Yeah. And this version, it would make sense that they don't argue this one, because this one emphasizes that the concept of God requires necessary existence.
Yeah, I mean, this another way to reformulate it is, instead of greater, either the greatest conceivable or, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, you could just say, well, God is maximal reality. If I take maximal reality to only, be a constant in my mind, by maximal reality, I understand something that includes more than just the limitations of my mind, which is yet another incoherency. Well, it's a contradiction, but at least it's the same thing. It has to exist. And again, the only issue these people have is fundamentally that they can't get rid of their associations of the word God to things that they assume, and therefore they don't like it. If you just called it the universe, they'd probably be a lot more open to it. But then they'd also probably just pay attention and realize it doesn't say very much.
Even though it's pretty much almost universally agreed that it just utterly fails. And, of course,
It's not universally agreed that it utterly fails. It's universally agreed that almost nobody likes it because it requires thinking. And a lot of modern philosophers can't think.
they go at the end and they plug in like, oh, 150. It's like, oh, like, no. Like, you guys are including arguments that are almost universally agreed to fail. I mean, I know that they said take seriously. Like, they said at the beginning that philosophers take these seriously. I guess that's in a sense like, yes, philosophers take this argument seriously in the sense that they grapple with it. They try to find where precisely it goes wrong. But most philosophers don't take it seriously in the sense of thinking that it does or even could succeed.
It does succeed. It's not that it could. It does. It's just trivial.
So, yeah, you could complain about internet atheists really just objecting to Anselm's ontological argument, but don't then turn around and use this as a kind of apologetic. And I know they said at the beginning that they're not, per se, advancing these arguments as an apologetic. And they also don't say at the beginning that they accept all of them, of course. But near the end, of course, they're like, but I do want to play around with the numbers. And then they start, like, showing how, oh, it's incredibly difficult to reject God's existence given all this stuff. Like, come on.
Okay, so jumping forward from Anselm to Descartes, there's a famous quote by Descartes, which is that I clearly see that existence can no more be separated from the essence of God than can its having three angles equal to two right angles be separated from the essence of a triangle, or the idea of a mountain from the idea of a valley. So there is no less absurdity in thinking of a God, a supremely perfect being, who lacks existence, than in thinking of a mountain without a valley. And so he gives this argument.
No, this is, again, the distinction between encoded and attributed. We can...
No. How can you say no to this? It's straightforward. Like, Descartes is right. That's the issue. If you understand what the object is being talked about, and you stop assuming, oh, like, this is talking about the daddy in the sky. There's no daddy in the sky. I can't accept this. Like, this doesn't actually, like, prove God is real. No, it just proves that if you understand by the greatest conceivable being, it exists. Whatever that may end up being. If you understand that there's a valley, then you got to understand entailed in it is mountains. If you understand that there's a triangle, entailed in that is the sum of the internal angles. It's definitional. Like, the only issue to be had with the argument is you disagree with the definition.
Recognize that encoded within the idea or concept of God is existence, and indeed necessary existence. Yeah, sure, that's part of the definition of God, but that doesn't at all commit you to saying that in a positive atomic belief, attributing existence or even necessary existence to God. I could, again, give the example of the smallest really existent Martian. By definition, this Martian exists, right? It's the smallest really existent Martian. So, it's part of its very definition to exist. But that's...
Nope, again, analogy fails. God is that in which nothing greater can be conceived. Inherent in that is everything. It's all perfections. It's all realities. It's the full degrees. There's nothing inherent in the little Martian. These people keep thinking, oh, it's about sentences. No, it's about the concept.
It just means
Also,
existence.
He might end up eating those words when we find microbiology on Mars. So it could actually exist. Most possible Martian.
Didn't we already have that? Like, didn't we have like that one meteor from Mars that, had bacteria and shit?
Possibly. There's water up there.
There certainly is.
Is encoded in this idea or this concept or this description. It doesn't mean that we have to attribute existence in a positive can no more find the interesting ways in which it fails and how...
Perfect being without existence. So, existence belongs to the nature of 1.
All right, let's see.
If I cannot conceive of x without y, then y belongs to the nature of x. 2, I cannot conceive of a supremely perfect being without existence. So, existence belongs to the nature of a supremely perfect being. 4, if existence belongs to the nature of a supremely perfect being, then a supremely perfect being exists. 5, a supremely perfect being exists.
So, premise 4 is false. Here's one way to see it. If I cannot conceive of x without y, then y belongs to the nature of x. I cannot conceive of a smallest really existent Martian without existence. If you're conceiving of a smallest really existent Martian...
He's not talking about
then if
any,
you have
he's
as
not talking
existing,
about any
then you fail to
thing.
conceive
He's
of...
talking about the supremely perfect being. It's not... You can't just replace whatever you want in there. It's talking about a specific concept.
Yeah, this is a weaker form. This is weaker definitely than Anselm's, because it has these ifs, whereas Anselm's is purely consequential. Now, the ifs don't break it, but they certainly make it weaker. So, I cannot conceive a supremely perfect being without existence. Therefore, existence belongs to the nature of a supremely perfect being. There you go. If existence belongs to the nature of a supremely perfect being, then supremely perfect being exists. It's the phrasing of 4 is what kind of really weakens it, because it does make it seem like he's talking about a concept, just merely a concept, rather than talking about a purely intelligible operation, which is a concept, but not in the way that these people normally understand it. So, this is just a rephrasing of the ontological arguments. If you look at the content, it's not that much different. It's just the way that it's phrased certainly makes it seem weaker.
Yeah, I agree. Especially with premise 1.
Yeah. Because it's also the phrasing, a supremely perfect being. By the time Descartes comes around, the way that the ontological argument was talked about was in this language of perfections. And perfections is what greatness became. Instead of talking about greatness like Anselm, now they were talking about the original new word, perfections. So, instead of perfect, treat that as a supremely great being. And then you could understand, I cannot conceive of a maximal real being without existence. Therefore, existence belongs to the maximal real being. If existence belongs to the maximal real being, then a maximal real being exists. And therefore, a maximal real being exists. Part of what ruins this, and it also kind of makes a little bit of a problem for Anselm's thing, is the framing of A. The A makes this seem like it's about a particular contingent kind of being, when God cannot be conceived that way. If it was just, you remove the A and just say supremely perfect being exists, or supremely perfect reality. Just that framing adds a lot of weight to how much sense that makes. Because it's one thing to say a maximally real being, as if it is some being here in the world in relationship to us, against us, separate from us in some way. Then if you frame it as maximal reality itself, all these island shit, all these bad analogies, those stupid little Martians, immediately on the face of it are revealed to not work. I don't know if you agree that makes it so much clearer if you just get rid of the particularity right there of A and just talk about the thing as such, maximal reality, greatest conceivability itself.
Yeah, there's a bit of ambiguity there.
Because I specified in that idea that it's the smallest really existent Martian. Therefore, existence belongs to the nature of a smallest really existent Martian. What it is to be a smallest really existent Martian is to really exist. That's part of its definition. Conclude that there is no objection, but we just proven the existence of Martians. No.
More or less included because of its historical importance. And I should note that Spinoza, in my mind,
you're not able to go simply from the fact that some property P belongs to X's nature, that it is true that there exists an X such that X is P. All you're saying, so I'm actually going to be a little bit short with this one because premise 1 has quite an obvious objection. Well, 2 quite obvious objections.
Pause it
Firstly,
right there.
you have the
Actually,
symmetry problem for this one. You can
Can we
So
open
this
the original?
is, yeah, this is Proslogion 3. And the way he's framing it is not what it is.
That's what I suspected.
So let me see. So, and it assuredly exists so truly that it cannot be conceived not to exist. For it is possible to conceive of a being which cannot be conceived not to exist, and this is greater than one which can be conceived not to exist. Hence, if that, than which nothing greater can be conceived not to exist, it is not that, than which nothing greater can be conceived. But this is an irreconcilable contradiction. There is then so truly a being than which nothing greater can be conceived to exist, that it cannot even be conceived not to exist. And this being thou art, O Lord, or our God. Oh, that's a different argument right there. So truly therefore dost thou exist, O Lord, my God, that thou canst not be conceived not to exist. And rightly, for if a mind could conceive of a being better than thee, the creature would rise above the Creator, and this is most absurd. And indeed whatever else there is, except thee alone, can be conceived not to exist. To thee alone, therefore, it belongs to exist more truly than all other beings, and hence in a higher degree than all others. For whatever else exists does not exist so truly, and hence in less degree it belongs to it to exist. Why then has the fool said in his heart that there is no God, since it is so evident to a rational mind that thou dost exist in the highest degree of thee? So maybe he's not talking about that one. Let's see the possibility. But how is the fool in his heart not conceived? But if really nay, since really he both conceived because he said in his heart, and did not say in his heart because he could not conceive. There is more than one way in which a thing can concede. Because I know I saw it the other day. I was looking at this. Because the way he frames it is not a modality like he's going to frame it.
Yep. Yeah, that's what I suspected when I saw it is possible. I thought he was going to couch it in the language of possibilities and modality, when the text is actually saying, we can do this, we can conceive.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's exactly how it went. He's like, it is possible to conceive this, meaning that we can do it. It's not about modalities or potential, like possible worlds or anything like that. I don't even see. Let me look up where that is. Classical version slide. The argument describes. Second version. There are two different versions of ontological arguments. Proslogion, the second version does not rely on the highly permanent claim that exists as a property. Okay, no, yeah. Okay, yeah, it is Proslogion 3. So it doesn't mention possibility, but it does mention necessity. It's okay, but how has the fool said in his heart that he could not conceive? How has the fool said in his heart what he could not conceive? Or how is it that he could not conceive what he said in his heart, since it is the same to say in the heart to conceive? But if really, nay, since really he both conceived because he said in his heart, and did not say in his heart because he could not conceive, there is more than one way in which a thing is said in the heart or conceived. For in one sense, an object is conceived when the word signifying it is conceived, and in another, when the very entity, which the object is understood. In the former sense, an object is conceived when the word signifying it is conceived, then God can be conceived not to exist. But in the latter, not at all. Even he knew that the whole language shit was bullshit. This is how old that misunderstanding is. There is what you say in words and what actually can be meant by them. And when you get away from the words and you look at the content, what is actually meant, it can only go one way. So you can say, oh, God is just a concept in my mind. I understand that you mean by God, but by God you mean that than which nothing greater can be conceived. But that's just in your head. So you have said that. And by saying that, you believe that God can be conceived not to exist because you say it. But in the latter, which is when the very entity which the object is understood. If you understand the content of what you're saying, it cannot be conceived that God does not exist. For no one who understands what fire and water are can conceive fire to be water in accordance with the nature of the facts themselves, although this is possible according to the words. So then, no one who understands what God is can conceive that God does not exist, although he says these words in his heart, either without any or with some foreign signification. For God is that than which a greater cannot be conceived, and he who thoroughly understands this assuredly understands that this being so truly exists that not even in concept can it be non-existent. Therefore, he who understands that God so exists cannot conceive that he does not exist. I thank thee, gracious Lord, I thank thee, because what I formerly believed by thy bounty, I now so understand by thine illumination, that if I were unwilling to believe that thou dost exist, I should not be able to understand this to be true. Oh. That was 4. Well, here's 3. So, and it surely exists so truly, so that it cannot be conceived not to exist. All right. For it is possible to conceive of a being. Oh, there it is. So, for it is possible to conceive of a being which cannot be conceived not to exist. And this is greater than one which can be conceived not to exist. It is possible to conceive of a being which cannot be conceived not to exist. That's the negative form of necessary existence. Hence, if that than which nothing greater can be conceived not to exist, it is not that than which nothing greater can be conceived. But this is an irreconcilable contradiction. There is then so truly a being than which nothing greater can be conceived to exist, that cannot even be conceived not to exist, and this being thou art, O Lord our God. So yeah, the possible here is not about modality. It's more about potentialities, that we can do this, and we do this. We do conceive of a being that nothing greater than can be conceived, and in understanding that, it is not possible, or rather, a being that cannot be conceived not to exist, which is entailed in nothing greater than can be conceived. So truly, therefore, dost thou exist, O Lord my God, that thou canst not be conceived not to exist, and rightfully. For if a mind could conceive of a being better than thee, the creature would rise above the creator. I already read that. Anyways, yeah. So, premise 1 here. It is possible that the greatest conceivable being exists. That is not a premise in the original argument.
Also say it's possible that the greatest conceivable being doesn't exist. And of course, then you can run through pretty much the exact same argument and get that, no, it doesn't exist. And what Malcolm is allegedly showing here is that we are going essentially from the possibility of this thing to its necessary existence. But then, of course, you could just say, well, no, it's possible that it doesn't exist, and then you're actually going to be able to conclude its impossibility. So you can equally well run an argument saying it's possible that the greatest conceivable being doesn't exist.
Wow. Anselm was a fucking 6,000 IQ genius. He refuted this guy, like, what was it? 1,000-something years ago?
He read him like a book.
Should have read the Proslogion 4.
And then you can conclude that there is no such being, and indeed there cannot be such a being. And so what that means is that why the heck should we accept premise 1 as opposed to that symmetrical premise that it's possible that no greatest conceivable being exists? You can't appeal.
Well, you don't appeal to it.
Like,
You don't
well,
accept it because, as Anselm said, if you understand the content, it's meaningless. It's meaningless to say, like, oh, well, I can understand that the greatest conceivable being does not exist. It's contradictory. You don't get it.
There being a world in which the greatest conceivable being exists, because I can also conceive of a world in which it is true that there is no such greatest conceivable being. So anyway, there's a symmetry problem for this first premise. You can run a reverse argument with a...
I can conceive of a world in which there is no greatest conceivable being, which would be the world itself. So I conceive of a world where there is no world. Genius. I mean, I know you know, but for those of you watching, pay attention to this stupid shit people say. Pay attention to like the implicit ways in which they say. For these people, the world, the universe, is their version of God, okay? Now, forget about the multiverse and stuff. If there are multiverses, they're just universes within one great universe. It's all within one world. And even if you accept, well, maybe there's possible worlds. Well, there are possible worlds in one domain of actual possibility. So it's still one world. The greatest conceivable being is the maximal reality. The maximal reality is, guess where reality is? It's the world. Not in the world, it is the world itself. So when you say, well, I can conceive of a world in which the greatest conceivable being does not exist, well, it's just basically saying I conceive of a world where the world does not exist. I mean, you square that circle. Right? Pay attention to the content of words. Don't let words fool you. That's how these people get lost. I don't think he's lying, you know. I don't think that he's being malicious or devious and like misunderstanding things on purpose. I just think this guy's honestly a midwit who's confused by words and hasn't realized how words confuse people. Doesn't realize that words aren't reality. Doesn't understand how concepts actually work, how thinking actually works, and how semantics like operates. Which is why they can say things that are utterly stupid and meaningless with complete seriousness and a high assurity of themselves. You know, I would say that this is what analytic brain rot does to you, but unfortunately it's not just analytics. Continentals suffer this a lot, and we got quite a few social trends to blame for this, all originating not even in the Enlightenment, but really originating far, far before the Enlightenment, rooted deeply in our cultures in the West. Because you don't find stupid shit like this much of anywhere else. Stuff like this kind of like arose, say, like in India a little bit, and in China. China not so much, because the Chinese never really cared too much about like these verbal word games. There was a small group historically that called the logicians, but they didn't really go very far. And most of them were just kind of like doing these things, which are like weird word games, but still somewhat conceptual. Anyways, word cells.
Incompatible conclusion that has a possibility premise that is equally as modest as this premise, and that is at least as intrinsically probable as this premise. And I would argue that it's actually more intrinsically probable. And the second problem, again, is
more intrinsically probable? Like, again, like inherent in the greatest conceivable being, or that than which nothing greater than can be conceived, is existence. It's not more intrinsically. What was it that you just said?
Just like, listen, it's a possibility to conceive of a world in which it is true that there is no such greatest conceivable being. So anyway, there's a symmetry problem for this first premise. You can run a reverse argument with an incompatible conclusion that has a possibility premise that is equally as modest as this premise, and that is at least as intrinsically probable as this premise.
Intrinsically probable. Yeah, no, they're not equally intrinsically probable. One of those is 100% certain, according to the measure that's given, and the other one is literally denied 100% according to the measure that's given. Circles don't have sides. They're not squares, they're not triangles, they're not octagons, dodecagons. They cannot be equated. That's like saying that it's equally probable that a circle could have like a trillion sides or 3 sides. Well, no, the circles don't have sides.
And I would argue that it's actually more intrinsically probable. And the second problem, again, is just like a gripe of mine. Just like plausibility, probability is one of those other slimy words today that people use to slide right through very difficult conceptual problems in an argument so that they don't have to actually do the work of proving what they're
claiming. You just gotta say, it's plausible, it's probable, without ever telling you what the actual measure is and what guarantees that measure.
Listen, no one who isn't antecedently inclined to theism would be willing to grant this first premise without being given some other independent argument in favor of it. Because to grant that it's possible that a greatest conceivable being exists, we know that that just is to grant that the greatest conceivable being actually exists. So no atheist would ever grant this first premise, and indeed...
One, modal arguments are stupid, but even when I was an atheist, I thought the ontological argument was great. I thought it was weird, certainly, but I understood what it was saying, and I realized early on, yeah, it's kind of trivial. So it's the most interesting theological argument of the classical era, but I mean, you can accept it and go like, yeah, okay, it doesn't say much of anything.
You would antecedently have to reject atheism in order to even be in a position to accept this first premise. As Avi points out, if you accept the principles of modal logic that support the inferential moves in the argument, and
which I don't accept modal logic.
You agree that there's an unsurpassably great being or that there's a greatest conceivable being, then you'll of course think that the argument is sound. But contrariwise, if you accept the principles of modal logic that support the inferential moves in the argument, and you agree with those who deny that there's an unsurpassably great being, or with those who deny that there's a greatest conceivable being, then you will think that the argument is unsound. Once we have both of these arguments before us, that it's possible that such a being exists and it's possible that it doesn't exist, it's obvious that neither of them provides anyone with any reason to change their views about whether there's an unsurpassably great being. It just doesn't give anyone any additional reason to think that God exists. Whether or not you think the argument is sound is just going to entirely be a function of your pre-existent commitments, whether or not you are a theist or an atheist, and so it's just dialectically toothless. The same is going to be going pretty much for every single modal ontological argument, unless, of course, you're providing an independent reason, a symmetry breaker, an independent argument that favors one possibility premise over the other. So anyway, because of the implausibility of at least lots of these modal arguments, we are going to be skipping them in the sense of just going through.
It's a good thing this isn't a modal argument.
Yeah. But notice that because of the implausibility, no requirement, you just gotta say it's implausible. And there you go. Implausible, improbable, no basis of like what constitutes an actual possibility, what probability is being measured by. Probable is according to what? What are the chances of the universal die rolling on any side? Well, how many sides does it have? Who knows? He brings up this whole thing about symmetry breakers. The argument already has a symmetry breaker. There is nothing that is going to be equal to that in which nothing greater can be conceived. There's only one thing that it qualifies for that. We call it God. You may want to call it the universe, doesn't matter, but there's going to be only one thing that's going to fit that bill. Whatever you want to call it. There's not going to be two, not three.
I think you commented this earlier, but the way modal realists or people that use modal logic employ the concept of possibility denies it any actuality. So for them, possibility is possible, but it's completely subjective. A universe which is exactly the same in every single sense, except this thing I subjectively choose is different. Or, you're right, they don't stick to the measure. There's just no necessity, and philosophy is about necessity. What necessarily follows and what is the case. And employing, possibility, probability, all these different statistical terms, that's not philosophy. They're not doing philosophy. They're just, I guess, navel gazing or doing free write exercises.
Yeah, like the concept of God is a necessary concept. There is no, because it is the greatest conceivable, or is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Possibilities, contingencies are for relative beings of which some other being, which they can't overtake, they can't subsume, can be conceived. God has no equal of that kind. God is not subject to some enabling condition in which God could or could not, fail to attain. God is there are transcendental arguments that you can easily show that God is going to be the necessary condition of possibility of everything, including possibility and actuality themselves. So anybody who would qualify God by modality is an idiot. Actually, idiot's not the proper word. Stupid. That's just, they don't understand what they're saying. They don't understand what the issue at hand is. They don't think about the concept. That goes both for the atheists and the theists who are like putting forth these stupid arguments. And just let me skip ahead. Proslogion 2. Well, let's see Anselm's other argument. What he has to say about that one.
God can be conceived. God can be conceived.
Other argument.
Conceived to exist, but cannot be conceived to be caused. Therefore, God actually exists.
So the person who wrote the book may have anticipated what I'm about to say, but at least prima facie, I reject premise 1. Consider the following. This is a
Let's see. If anything that cannot be conceived to be caused can be conceived to exist, it actually exists. God can be conceived to exist, but cannot be conceived to be caused, therefore God actually exists.
Yeah, the uncaused cause, or the unconditioned.
So if anything that cannot be conceived to be caused can be conceived to exist, it actually exists. God can be conceived to exist, but cannot be conceived to be caused. Therefore, God actually exists.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of ambiguity. I predict he's just going to say that, well, I can conceive of something that isn't God. That doesn't imply the greatest maximal being, or whatever the terminology or phrase Anselm uses.
Yeah. That than which nothing greater can be conceived. Now, this is just phrased weirdly. If anything that cannot be conceived to be caused can be conceived to exist, it actually exists. God can be conceived to exist, but cannot be conceived to be caused. I don't even see what causality does in this argument. Like, it's just like, well, if anything can be conceived, if God is an uncaused cause, well, if God is uncaused, can be conceived. Yeah, let me just rephrase it. So if anything that can be conceived to be uncaused can be conceived to exist, it actually exists. God can be conceived to exist and is an uncaused. The but, should be like an and is an uncaused, and he is uncaused. Therefore, God actually exists. They just phrase this like terribly.
Is there something missing, like context, or is this the actual argument?
This does not sound like something Anselm would say. I don't even know why they're saying this is the other argument. The other argument was the one in Proslogion 3.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't even know. If Anselm didn't say it, I have no interest in listening to it. The phenomenal defense. All right, most of this other stuff ends up being about like modal arguments, which they're all garbage. And he seems to just have to be repeating the same 4 objections, which none of them work for the original argument, and the original argument is the best argument by far. It's also the case that the argument is not supposed to be taken in abstraction. The Proslogion is a set of arguments that build up to one, conclusion, or a few conclusions related to those arguments. So you're not really supposed to take it in abstraction and think that this is some clincher and therefore, the Christian God exists. It builds up. So, anyways, for those of you watching, I hope you find that entertaining. I certainly have fun doing it. Academic philosophy sucks. See you around.